Ladies and gentlemen, independent Americans around the country and around the world. Let's all take a big, deep breath because it has been one of the most intense weeks of our lifetime. And when we have moments like this, I want to bring in leaders who can be a conscience for America and help give us vision, inspiration, perspective, experience to take us through it. And I thought of no better person for a number of different reasons than one of my favorite leaders in America, the great and powerful Jake Wood is back on Independent Americans. Welcome back, sir.
Good to be back, Paul. It's been a minute.
It's been a minute. I know you just got off a plane. You're out there doing a lot of stuff. You're doing a lot of good stuff, and I want to get into the assassination attempt, the atmosphere in America, your viewpoint as a father, a voice of reason. But let's start with the thing I always start with. Where are you and how are you?
Well, I am at my office here in Los Angeles. I'm good, a little travel, so a little road weary, but no, man, listen, I think the last week has been a little bit insane. I think I'm still trying to process exactly what it means. And, like most Americans, I think a little nervous about the future, but, not going to go down without a fight. So, looking forward to the conversation.
I love that. You just got off a plane. You're a dad of some young kids. Can I start? I've asked other people this, and I think it sometimes is instructive. How do you talk to your kids about everything that's going on? Do you talk to your kids about what's going on? How do you approach this in your home? You talk a lot about command climate and leadership and values, but in your own home, for people who are trying to navigate this, who aren't public speakers, who aren't running national organizations, how do you approach it?
Well, I mean, I've got a 5.5-year-old and a 3-year-old, both little girls. It's a little too early for them to even be aware. They're not even aware of what's happening in the world. And so we don't talk about it at home. I think I go home, and the moment I walk through the door, I'm reminded why the stakes are so high. So while we're not having the conversation, I think my kids serve as a reminder for, why this matters.
You and your wife, inspiring family. You've both been in the limelight for a long time. People look to you for perspective and analysis. Can you break it apart a little bit? I mean, I don't even know what to compare it to. There's just so much happening that can be overwhelming, but one of your great abilities is strategic leadership. So can you talk about the environment we're in as a nation and how you think we should all attempt to approach it?
I mean, listen, I can only repeat what's being said kind of in all corners of the media ecosystem, left, right, and center. I think we are in an environment that is, hyperpolarized. I think that we are searching for common ground when it appears that there is none. I think one of the saddest parts about what happened on Saturday with the assassination attempt of former President Trump is that I don't think it actually changed anybody's minds about anything, and I think that's a really dangerous place for us to be in. You look at, and you can look at as well, his conviction on felony charges. Again, it didn't change anybody's mind. And so what that means is, like, we're so deeply entrenched in our camps that these truly, President Trump's assassination attempt is not unprecedented in the true meaning of that word. We've obviously had political assassinations, political assassination attempts in this history. But there are other elements of this campaign, President Biden's debate performance, for example, that do seem unprecedented in the true sense of that word. And yet I don't know that anybody's minds are being changed. And it's just a really weird, seemingly parallel universe to be in.
I think that's a good way of putting it, man. You've got a varied experience. One of the things that I wanted you to talk about is you were a sniper in the Marine Corps. We have a different perspective when we see something like an assassination attempt. I remember guarding high value targets in Iraq. I remember being on rooftops. I mean, I've been in combat situations. You've been in combat situations, both as a combatant and as a humanitarian around the world. But you've been the guy behind the rifle. Can you talk about that from a tactical standpoint? What do you see? What did people not see? How do you break down, as an experienced sniper, that tactical situation?
Yeah, I mean, lots of opinions there, and I think that they're changing every time new updates are coming out as to, exactly how these buildings were oriented, and various reports about who knew what when. So I preface everything I'm about to say with, it's a pretty fluid information, vacuum right now. It's constantly, things are dribbling out. I think my first reaction was, how the hell did this happen? Catastrophic failure, I think, both in leadership, in planning, and then certainly in execution at the moment when this began to unfold. So let's kind of start with leadership. One of the things that I think is most inexplicable is that a security team was not present on the roof from which the shooter fired at President Trump, because the roof had a slope. And we've now seen that roof. It's one of the most famous. It's probably the most famous roof in the entire world. And the grade of that roof slope, the grade of that roof slope is inconsequential. I mean, yeah, sure, someone could trip and fall, but like, we're talking about elite law enforcement officers, whether it was local SWAT team or whether it was Secret Service. I mean, it's just inexplicable not to have someone on that roof for the sake of that minimal slope. Planning. So furthermore, so that was a leadership failure, right? The failure to analyze that risk and put it into context of what your mission is. Then you have the planning failure, not having the building secured. Apparently one of the counter sniper teams had an obstructed view of that building. The other team that had an unobstructed view was actually oriented southward, not north to that building. So it was a multiple failures. And then, in the execution, I think I want to give some grace to the counter sniper who apparently, flinched and hesitated in that moment. And I just want to, for people, put that into context. The only arena that I've ever operated as a sniper was a combat arena. And, if someone had a gun, that person was a valid target, and you didn't hesitate, you took the shot. I think a law enforcement sniper, which I will, put the Secret Service into. I'm unsure if he had any combat experience, but this idea of, shooting an American citizen, you got to be sure, you got to know, and you take that extra moment of precaution. Am I really going to shoot and kill this American citizen? And the last thing you want to be is the Secret Service agent who shot, a New York Times reporter who climbed up on the roof with a long lens camera to try to get a better shot. Mm-hmm. And so I do want to provide some grace to him. At the same time, I think from what we're hearing now, there were radio transmissions that were going around that there was a suspect that was armed, that was on a roof. And I think you pull all these things together, the fact that he got multiple shots off is, it's a catastrophe.
I think the reconstruction and the analysis and investigation feels to me almost like 9/11, right? When we're going to try to work through all the different breakdowns at different levels in communication and leadership and execution that allowed to such a catastrophic failure. Can you talk about something that I think a lot of amateurs are talking about, the shot itself? Like now Don Jr. says it's like missing a 5-foot putt or something, he said, right? All the mitigating factors of having a cop running up behind you, your blood pressure, all the other pieces. But how lucky were we, as a world that he missed that shot? Talk about that tactical presentation of this civilian guy on a rooftop with a long rifle.
Yeah, I actually have been asking people to reframe this. I think most people have been asking, wow, how did he possibly miss? And I think maybe the question is, wow, how did he get so close? Yeah. I don't know anything about this kid. I doubt he had any formal training in marksmanship. It sounds like he took his dad's rifle to the range occasionally. And so he had some marksmanship practice, however informal. But here's what I would say. He's a young kid, no experience. I think it's safe to assume he's never shot at another human being before. Anybody that's been in combat knows that the first time you put those sights on a human being and you pull the trigger, your heart is pounding through your chest. There's just a lot of factors there. We now know that he was confronted on that rooftop by a police officer. So now this is compounded even further. And frankly, I think you take all those things together, and I think it's remarkable how close he came. Nonetheless, we are so lucky. This was a semi-automatic rifle. He didn't have to be all that accurate in order to inflict significant damage. And it wasn't just President Trump. We know innocent bystanders have been killed and critically wounded. So, if this was a formally trained sniper on that rooftop, you're hitting within 1 inch. That would be the standard at 150 yards. 1 minute of angle equates to about 1.5 inches at that distance. And so there's just no way you miss that shot. But again, this was a kid, no formal training, probably heart beating at 200 beats per minute. And an adrenaline that is sucking all of the blood out of his fingers into his core organs. I mean, it's remarkable that he got as close as he did.
I really appreciate you breaking that down. I was hoping you would help us understand that, because it's the kind of analysis that you don't get between like Viagra commercials on cable news, right? Like you're actually talking us through the process of it, which I think is really important for people to have. I always say I want to bring light, not heat to this discussion. I think you just brought a lot of light there. I mean, you're also taking a bigger step back on the macro. You're also a guy that's talked a lot about and helped bridge the civil military divide, right? We've got this time where, we're all of us, at least I was saying, thank God it's not a vet, right? Like we don't want somebody perpetuating the stereotype. More likely than not, the helpers are usually the vets, right? We see the EMS workers, the folks in the Secret Service, so many other folks that are responding. And you've been that at Team Rubicon. When I say look for the helpers, you guys are an example. But there's this moment now where veterans have been so politicized by both parties, by everyone. As we record this on Wednesday night, tonight, JD Vance is going to be nominated for vice president. I believe the first time a Marine has ever been nominated in the major ticket, the first enlisted person, I think, since Al Gore, the first veteran since John McCain. So it's symbolically a big moment. Historically, it's also the first post 9/11 vet. You and I have talked a lot about who might be the first 1 or 2 or 3 to go up there. But can you talk about the importance of it, how you think about it? Does it matter that much? You're one of the most high profile next generation Marines. What do you think about it?
Well, listen, I think it's important for us to have veteran representation in leadership within our government. I think the world is a complex and dangerous place. It's becoming increasingly so with a belligerent Russia, belligerent China, reports of Iran having assassination plans for former President Trump. I mean, for us to think that we can take a dovish approach to the global, threat scene is I think just ignorant. So I think it's good to have a veteran on the ticket. And I think JD Vance is a very intelligent person. And I commend him for what he has done with his life. I read his book when it came out 10 years ago. I was blown away with his story. I was proud that he was a Marine and that the Marine Corps was a part of his journey to escape, an insane upbringing. And, what an American dream. I disagree with a lot of JD Vance's politics. I disagree with a lot of his rhetoric. And so I think that, I can both be proud that we have a Marine on the ticket, and I can, be opposed to a lot of what he espouses in his beliefs. And I think what's going to be interesting is I do believe that JD Vance loves this country. I believe he wants what's best for it, and we can have difference of opinions about what that looks like. I hope that as he kind of ascends into the this seat of power, a heartbeat away from the presidency, that, it might temper some of like his stances and positions that I would take most issue with. Let's take war in Ukraine. I know this is a huge issue for you, Paul. And, obviously JD Vance has been one of the leading opponents of security aid to Ukraine. We have seen this tune before. We saw Mike Johnson ascend to the Speaker of the House, and he was also very vocally opposed to aid to Ukraine. And then perspectives change when you find yourself perhaps the single person standing behind preserving democracy and freedom in Ukraine, and just trying to score some talking points for your constituents back home. And I hope we see maybe a similar transformation for JD Vance, should he enter the White House with President Trump. But I think everybody can just speculate right now.
This is why I wanted your analysis. You're pulling apart so many important pieces, but it also underscores why I wish you would run for office. And I think that there's, we've launched American Veterans for Ukraine, which you've been outspoken in support of. And I think so many veterans have been outspoken about Ukraine. It hits really hard to us. We also launched, Independent Veterans of America. There's a need for new leadership. Before we get to that piece, though, for a long time, we've always been watching, like, who are going to be the 2 proxy vets for the parties. At some point, it's going to happen. Now we know Vance is up there. Wes Moore is ascendant. if Biden steps aside, there's a scenario where West could be the vice presidential candidate, could be the candidate. I mean, we could have Vance versus Moore this year, and definitely much more possible 4 years from now. We could have had DeSantis. We could have had Eric Greitens we talked about back in the day, but it feels like there is this almost a generation where there are going to be a lot of vets fighting it out in the political arena. And that I think is important. And I think hopefully will be a net gain. But in the meantime, there are so many of us that are sitting out, right? Like people want you to run for office. People want other people to run for office. And there are a lot of people that are just so disgusted by the politics, they're out of it. What does it take to get a guy like you to be in government? And I'm using you specifically because I think a lot of folks are waiting for a dam to break. And they're waiting for more independent veterans and independent leaders to step forward. And this GOP convention is happening in your home state of Wisconsin. So you're a guy who would resonate in a place like that. But for you and people like you, what a lot of generals have told me, it's just not for us. But this feels like a moment where we need everybody. So how do you think about that?
Yeah, listen, I get posed the question a lot, and I think it's just an evaluation of where you can have impact, and I understand this is like a chicken and egg argument, right? If I go to Congress, if I were to go to the Senate, I'm going to get swallowed up by this circus that is what exists there, and you can be the most principled person in the world. I think you go to that environment and your principles just kind of smash against the brick wall of partisanship, like a wave crashing, against the shoreline. And so I guess for me, it's always an evaluation of where can I have impact? Where can I shape the battle space, right? And so I'm trying to think about how do I, with what I'm currently doing with Groundswell, how do we unlock the generosity of an entire generation of Americans, and if we can do that, I'm thinking about the tectonic shift that we're trying to create in how, individuals and companies approach giving back to their community. That's a rising tide that I think starts to lower the temperature. It brings people together in service. It gets people to think not just about themselves, but about others. Like that's how you shape our community in a way that actually creates space for bipartisanship and progress in politics. And so, for me, I at the risk of sounding like I have too high of opinion of myself, I think I would kind of waste my capability by going to government. If that makes sense.
I hear you on that. I disagree because I think we need you. But I love to see you do these different things. I wanted to ask you because this doesn't get talked about enough. I want to talk about Team Rubicon and the work you're doing there. The logo's over your shoulder for people who are watching on video. I remember when you had it on a napkin when we were at Storm the Hill in a blizzard many years ago. You had just come back from Haiti. But can you talk about what is it like to be an entrepreneur right now? We talked about this chaotic political environment, but it's also an uneasy economic environment. You're building a startup. Can you talk about what it's like to be a CEO and an entrepreneur in this environment?
I at the risk of dodging your question, I'll answer it maybe through a different lens. There's a lot of, or recently, I don't know if I should qualify it as a lot, but two of the most prominent VCs in Silicon Valley, and Andreessen Horowitz, A16Z, the iconic venture capital firm, came out in support of Donald Trump's presidency, and I think it's a departure from the norm in Silicon Valley, and the in defending that decision, they said we think that President Trump is what's best for the economy and the startup, specifically the startup ecosystem. That may or may not be true. I don't know that that's necessarily true, but I think really smart people can argue either way on that. I guess my point is, if you're kind of pushing aside all of the threats that you see that exist within a Donald Trump presidency, the stakes with NATO and our allies, our place in the world, is it really worth trading the prospects of your startup for that, right? And so when I think about the business environment, hey, I think about if Donald Trump actually lowers corporate tax rates from 21 to 15% as he's proposed, like that would be really good for my business, not because we pay that tax rate, but because the companies we're selling to would suddenly be flush with a lot more cash. Like that would be a good environment for me. is it worth the trade?
Mhm.
And so I always challenge my friends, my family, to not just think about. I think often people are voting with their wallets. I think it's a natural tendency. I'm asking for people to kind of vote with kind of their citizenship in mind, and that's going to mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and they still might reach the same conclusion.
Mhm.
But I just don't think they should reach it by thinking exclusively about their wallets.
This is the perspective that I hope Silicon Valley hears more from, because I hear it from vets, right? Like people who have had more international experience or humanitarian work, or they've worked in State Department. I mean, there is a class of billionaires and tech billionaires who never served this country in any way, and are now driving, policy, making endorsements. Elon also endorsed Trump the night he was shot. I mean, they have an outsized influence, but I hear more moderation, more centrism, more perspective, and a different set of values, quite frankly, from someone like you who's been in the Marine Corps than someone who hasn't. So it's been exciting also to see the rise of more veterans and people who've served in other ways in business and in Silicon Valley. And you're bringing that ethos to Groundswell, and the great success you're doing there. And I just want to celebrate that and encourage everybody to check it out. But let's finish with some hope, because you're always bringing and spreading and selling hope. And in times like this, especially, Team Rubicon, this great thing you've built, is running in when people are running out. There are still storms hitting, in the midst
Yep.
of all this, that probably aren't getting the attention they would have gotten otherwise. You've been on a couple times now. I remember during COVID and after other disasters. Can you just share with people, what's Team Rubicon doing right now, and why is it an example of what's great about America?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is this is probably going to be one of the worst hurricane seasons on record, and it's crazy because we say that about every 2 or 3 years over the last decade. But I think Hurricane Beryl was a bellwether for what's to come. It was the strongest storm as early in the season as it hit, and it really crushed Texas. And you see the confluence of other factors, the lost power. Combined with the extraordinary midsummer heat in Houston. I mean, it's really pretty scary. And I think that as we look out over the rest of July, August, September, it could get really bad. So, Team Rubicon, buckling their chin straps, getting ready, obviously responded on the ground for Hurricane Beryl, but thinking about the next, 2.5 months, and it's coming at a time when there's more headwind in philanthropy than we've seen in a long time. Inflation has really eroded, household incomes, and with that, a lot of dry powder, a lot of philanthropy has dried up, combined with the election. So you have a lot of wealthy people who would otherwise be given to philanthropy who are instead diverting those funds to super PACs.
Mhm.
Even though they're not tax deductible, it's still, it's a mutually exclusive decision for many. And then you have, more moderate income households who do often give to charity, but who just can't afford to anymore. And so, we're seeing the effects of that. It's been a challenging fundraising environment. I think the worst thing that could happen to Team Rubicon is we are faced with a tough decision where we have to say no in the face of a disaster because we can't afford it, and that's a tragedy.
Mhm. But in the midst of all this bad news, you've still got people signing up every day and going out in missions. And in many ways, anybody who's been around a Team Rubicon event or Team Rubicon leadership, I mean, it's kind of like how we wish America would work, right? I mean, we saw this sadly in Kyiv last week when the children's hospital got hit. Everybody went into the pile, right? And that
Yeah.
reminded me a lot of what I saw, on 9/11, a couple of blocks from where I'm sitting now. But there's that spirit. And maybe we can end. What are can you remind everybody the values of Team Rubicon? Because I don't feel like values are being talked about a lot in America right now, especially from our politicians. But can you remind us about the values that you wove into that are now blossoming in really important ways?
Yeah, I mean, we were born out of a bias for action, this notion of, we can't be a spectator when we see suffering. And so, I think that's one of those things we always challenge people, when we talk about the mission of our organization is, we exist to be there for someone on their worst day. And you can really pull that back and just, take your approach to life, everything you do, every interaction that you have. Every day, when you're walking through New York, Paul, you're going to pass someone who's literally having their worst day. So how are we carrying ourselves so that we're more empathetic, more compassionate? We're listening to, our friends or family when they need that ear. We're giving that advice when we can. We're we're reaching down and dropping that dollar in someone who's, sleeping on the streets, and just showing that compassion, giving somebody that dignity. Those little micro actions. You don't have to hop on a plane and deploy to Houston for a hurricane in order to make the community better around you. It's just all those little micro actions throughout the day, giving people that grace that they deserve.
You do that, man. And I always say, look for the helpers. And I've many times over the last couple of years, been times when I'm feeling like I need a boost, and I literally like, what's Team Rubicon up to? And I'll go over here and I'll retweet something, I'll repost something. I encourage folks to do the same thing. It's an amazing thing that you've built. It's an amazing message that you spread. This week, a bearded Marine will be nominated for vice president. I wish it was a different one. I wish it was you being nominated, and maybe that'll be something down the line. But in the meantime, man, thank you for all you're doing for so many communities. Thank you for what you're doing for this country. And thank you for setting an example. Leadership is hard and requires a lot of sacrifice. You're taking time away from your kids and your family, but you're doing it for the greater good. And I just want to thank you, let you know I'm proud of you and honored to be a friend. And thanks for coming back on the show again to share some more.
Well, I appreciate it, Paul. Thanks for the conversation.
All right, brother. Stay vigilant.